Well, for those of you who don't already know me, my name is Phoenix Aurelius. For the past 20 years, I have been practicing and researching Spagyria in a scientific and a clinical environment. Spagyria these days oftentimes has a connotation of being relinquished to a form of herbal alchemy, and it's typically taught pretty poorly. And what I mean by that is that most of the resources that I inherited when I first started learning were very wildly mediocre at best. And most of the people who are practicing today are also practicing using those techniques that were passed on to us largely by the Rosicrucian tradition and through the 20th century alchemical masters of Frater Albertus, also known as Dr. Albert Riedel, as well as Jean Dubuis of Les Philosophes de la Nature, or the Philosophers of Nature, which was a French organization that came to the United States and Canada in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and were translated primarily by a guy in Quebec called Patrice Malaisé. So basically, Spagyria, as I inherited it, as it reached me, was really preserved in a bit of a time capsule with the exception of a few items of Pharmacopoeia. And so much of it had actually already been stripped away and removed from the entirety of the tradition as it existed. So Spagyria was invented by a guy named Paracelsus, or Theophrastus Bombastus Philippus von Hohenheim. But he preferred...
Right, I'm like, are we reading Dr. Seuss?
Yeah.
Bombastus.
You're not far off. And actually I forgot his other name, Theophrastus Philippus Aurelius Bombastus von Hohenheim. I forgot the Aureolus. At any rate, he is a really interesting character, and any of you who have studied Western medicine have probably at least heard mention of him in a textbook or in a lecture somehow, because he was the inventor of modern toxicology. In fact, he was the first person in the entire history of Western medicine to insinuate that disease could possibly come from an outside source, either vibratory or physiological. And he noticed this by working with populations of miners and seeing that they had disproportionately higher lung diseases and other different types of diseases than other portions of the population. And he was a medic in the Swiss Army, and that took him anywhere that the Vatican, or the Holy Roman Empire at that time, really wanted to send him. And it's said and thought that he made it definitely as far east as modern-day Turkey and Syria, but he probably also went into India because a lot of his theories ended up showing so many different types of similarities to Ayurvedic medicine and other forms of Sanskrit medicine like Siddhi medicine or Unani medicine. So, very, very fascinating character. Not only did he invent modern toxicology, he also invented iatrochemistry, which is the entire basis for pharmaceutical medicine today. It's been entirely bastardized and altered massively from Paracelsus' original ideas. But Paracelsus in the 1500s was curing things like syphilis, the plague, leprosy, severe wasting diseases, chronic diarrhea, which, as we know, when people got the flu, even pre-early 1900s, one of the main causes of death was dehydration due to vomiting and diarrhea and things like this. He invented laudanum, and not the laudanum that we know of today, or even that they had in the 1800s, which was, again, a bastardized version, but Paracelsian laudanum, which was not addictive and did not stop up the individual entirely. So it would stop diarrhea or cure diarrhea, but it wouldn't stop the bowels from moving like most other opiates do, or especially like an opium poppy tincture traditionally would, like laudanum would, that was developed long after his time. He also invented no less than 2,600 different remedies and medicines. He also invented an entire system of medicine for diagnosis of disease, the treatment of disease, the philosophies behind it, why it worked, and so on and so forth. He was a very, very religious person. He was Catholic. Martin Luther was a contemporary to him. So the Protestant Reformation certainly had not ever happened during his time, but people, because they were both from in Germanic states at any rate, used to compare Paracelsus to Luther with his theological ideas, and he always said, please allow Luther to account for Luther and allow me to account for myself, saying that I have my own ideas and he has his own ideas, and we're totally different, so don't confuse us or try and lump us into some group just because it's easier for you to comprehend. He was a very interesting individual in that he was prolific in his writing, and he would verbally assassinate just about and eviscerate anybody who tried to tell him that he was wrong without being able to prove that he was wrong, because he proved that they were wrong 100% of the time. They said, hey, Paracelsus, you think you're so freaking clever. We're going to set you into a colony of lepers, and if you can heal all of them, then you get to walk away with your life, and if not, then I guess you're dying of leprosy. He said, all right. All but 2 people who were beyond curing walked out, and he walked out as well. He was able to cure an entire colony of lepers. Or at least so the story goes. We have some conflicting records on this, but this is one of the more well-documented aspects of what he did. He was healing kings and princes and principalities and constantly being treated poorly because he did not abide by the medical philosophy of his day, which was called Galenic medicine, or it was basically expanded upon by Galen, thus Galenic medicine, but it was a form of humoral medicine that had existed since the time of the Greeks, insinuating that all disease arises from these 4 humors and imbalances of these 4 humors inside of individuals: bilious, melancholy, phlegmatic, and sanguine. So Paracelsus completely revolutionized everything. Now, I just taught you more about the entire scope of Paracelsus and Spagyria in this quick 5 to 7 minute introduction than what they have ever taught in any book ever about Spagyric medicine, including in the modern day. Yes?
Do you have that written down somewhere?
A bit of it is on my website, yes.
Okay. What is your website?
PhoenixAurelius.org. First name, last name.org.
Right. Just .org. Got it.
Okay, so basically, nobody really presents Paracelsus in his entirety because they don't know how to handle it. They're not willing to go through the Middle High German that he spoke and to translate the text into English, although they are translated into modern German. And the books that do exist in English that talk about his medical philosophies, there's one in particular called Theophrastus Bombastus Philippus Areolus von Hohenheim, published by Brill Press, and that is in excess of $500, and it's a very thick tome. So people who want to study Paracelsianism do it from an armchair perspective in universities today, and it's pretty much relinquished only to the scholastic field, and again, from an armchair approach.
Not at all practical.
Not at all practical. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, what ended up happening was Paracelsus created his form of medicine. He had tons of students who loved him and loved his form of medicine and ended up practicing it. And it really took hold in France, and it really took hold in England. And these 2 places, in fact, there are a couple of books that you can look up. Again, these are also very pricey, called the French Paracelsians and the English Paracelsians. They ended up practicing what was called Paracelsian medicine, which was basically sometimes also called chemical medicine, meaning that he was using alchemical methods to create remedies, and then they were treating these remedies, treating various diseases and maladies and conditions utilizing spagyric remedies. So Paracelsus was way ahead of his time. Spagyric medicine was healing hundreds and hundreds of people, but there was a portion of Paracelsians, as they were identified, that didn't care so much about actually the medicinal part of it as much as the laboratory creation of the medicines. And he revolutionized the entire practice of alchemy and chemistry by giving it a sulfur-mercury salt theory. So from the Arabic Empire, a guy named Al-Jabir ended up creating this sulfur-mercury theory, this polar theory of sulfur and mercury. And again, when we're talking about sulfur and mercury, for those of you who aren't aware, we're not necessarily talking about brimstone and metallic mercury. What we're talking about are archetypes of sulfur and mercury, which today we would call positive polarity, negative polarity, right? We would call that polar, non-polar. We would call those, we would use that type of terminology. So Paracelsus came up and said, you guys are using salts, but you haven't incorporated it into your theory, and he created a third principle inside of chemical theory, which was salt. So now there's sulfur, mercury, and salt. And he ended up actually discussing this in a very, very clever way by drawing the analogies and saying that sulfur is the most active and dynamic principle. It corresponds to the soul of things, and it is a combination of the fire and air elements. And now Paracelsus, unlike his Greek predecessors and Galenic predecessors, did not think that the elements actually manifested themselves as humors inside of the body. He actually said that they are dimensional realities. So those of you who are familiar with the classes that I might be teaching here, you'll know that on Saturday I'm teaching about multidimensional anatomy. That is all based in Paracelsianism. That's not just like some new age thing that I'm starting to teach. This was actual Paracelsian tradition of the Spagyric tradition. So he says that fire corresponds to the spiritual dimension. He says that air corresponds to the causal dimension. He says that water corresponds to the astral dimension, and he says that earth corresponds to the physical dimension, and that all things are existing in those four dimensions simultaneously, and that they are essentially, to use modern terminology, parallel dimensions, parallel realities that stack one upon the other in order to create the animation of all life. So for those of you who were present at Dr. Kenneth's presentation, he was talking about vitality. Alchemy and Spagyria has a very, how shall we say, refined approach to explaining this otherwise dichotomy between materialism and the materialistic, mechanistic, very Newtonian viewpoint, and more subtle viewpoints that we would now refer to as like Einsteinian or quantum viewpoints in multidimensional realities. So again, he said that sulfur is the principle that deals with the soul, and it is a combination of the spiritual dimension and the causal dimension, which is, say, the elements of fire and air. He said that mercury is completely androgynous. It isn't polar. It's androgynous. In fact, it's hermaphroditic. And it's oftentimes seen as Mercury with one breast and a male chest, and then half of female genitalia, half of male genitalia, in a lot of different things. It is also sometimes referred to in Latin as a rebis. Rebis means the two thing or the double thing because it contains both qualities, but it's very hermaphroditic. In modern terminology, it could swing both ways. So with that being said, he said that Mercury is a combination of the causal dimension and of the astral dimension, which is to say of air and water. And so Mercury, like metallic mercury, is a liquid and it's a vapor. But water can also exist as a liquid, as a vapor. Alcohol can exist as a liquid, as a vapor. All of the solvents that we really know of can exist in those forms. They don't exist as solids. Show me powdered water, right? They don't exist as solids, and so their archetype is
calcium and
mercury.
fluoride. That's easy.
You don't have the blank enough stare to even convince me that you've been drinking fluoridated water. So, with that being said, he said that the third principle is salt, and salt is the other polar principle that opposes sulfur. Sulfur is very masculine, it's fiery. Salt is a combination of water and earth, which is to say astral and physical composition, and that it's a very fixed nature and it's of a very feminine polarity. It's very solid. So whereas sulfur is very volatile, or volatile would be the proper term, salt is very fixed. Now these things are important to talk about because sulfur equals soul, mercury equals spirit, and salt equals body. These are the triune, or the trifecta, so to speak, of alchemical reality since the time of Paracelsus. And the Rosicrucians actually took this theory and they applied some of the laboratory work and some of Paracelsus's teachings and some of other different types of teachings like Johann Baptista Porta and a good number of other alchemists as well, and kind of cherry-picked them and created a philosophy that worked for them. And by the time of the late 1800s, they had gone underground because the scientific revolution had come around, and they had said at that time, you know what, more things exist in the laboratory than just fire, air, water, earth, sulfur, mercury, and salt. There has to be more. And so we get like scientists like Lavoisier, right, discovering oxygen. We get people like Sir Robert Boyle, saying, writing books, being a practicing Paracelsian and saying, I'm a skeptical chemist. That was the name of his book. And saying there has to be more than just these elements, because they didn't have names for, say, potassium carbonate or potassium acetate. This is just the salt of this particular herb, or the salt of the vegetable kingdom. They didn't have specified terminology, chemical terminology, to refer to these different substances that we now have today. And so realistically, the scientific revolution said, you know what, we're discovering so many things so fast, we don't even want to be associated with the alchemists of old. We're doing our own thing now, and we're no longer calling it alchemy or chemy, we're calling it chemistry. And they decided to march in a slightly different direction and start to abandon the sulfur mercury salt theory altogether and to distance themselves from that entire world. And as they did that, they took almost everything that Paracelsus had said and almost all of his remedies and almost all of his theories, and they threw the baby out with the bathwater. And that was a great mistake from my perspective. So we fast forward to the beginning of Rockefeller medicine, which really began at the beginning of the 20th century, very late 19th century, very early 20th century. And they start funding only these scientific organizations. They get rid of eclectic medicine, they get rid of all these other things, and they end up revisiting all of Paracelsus's work, but they do it in a way that kind of bastardizes everything he talks about. So they take the iatrochemistry component and they say, you know what, we can find plant chemicals, especially from these places that we've colonized, like the Congo or like the Amazon, with all of these new amazing botanicals and a wide biodiversity to choose from. And they can find all of these plant chemicals and they can do it for cheap because they came in and took those things for nothing. And then we can take all of this mining refuse and all of the minerals that can be leached out of the waste from petroleum mining, and then we can combine those together and come up with really cheap medicines that can be effective. And instead of giving somebody white willow bark, we can make isolated salicylic acid, for instance. And they start compounding various different pharmaceutical medicines. Now, it's very important to say that Dr. Samuel Hahnemann, the inventor of homeopathy, also drew inspiration from Paracelsus in various aspects of his dosage in particular. So Paracelsus always used to say that it is the dosage of something that determines whether it is a medicine or a poison. And Hahnemann took that and ran with it in a direction that distances itself very much so. Bach, of Bach's Flower Remedies, also ended up drawing a lot of inspiration from the writings of Paracelsus and other alchemists after the time of Paracelsus with flower essences, knowing that if you collect the dew off of the flowers in particular, the dew is an alchemical substance. It is a condensed celestial light that mixes with terrestrial moisture, and those two things meet on flowers that contain a very airy signature, and those things have immense healing properties, largely because of the dew. So when people today are making them with distilled water and other things like this, I'm not saying that they're not effective, but I can definitively say that in clinical tests that I've run, they're not nearly as effective at all as dew-based medicines. Now, the dew-based medicines that you're getting like 2 drops per flower, maybe. So you have to collect a lot of flowers, but also you have very little dosage that you need to apply. For a commercial industry, though, that's not feasible. Correct. Yes.
Do those type of fluorescences also get diluted with alcohol and more spring water, or it's just the dew?
No, you never use spring water, period, inside of alchemical works. Maybe for fermentation, but then we always distill that ferment. So everything always ends up getting distilled and purified, because as things show up in the natural world, everything decays. If you leave spring water out for any length of time, it will grow algae. It will start to grow scum. It will start to ferment. It starts to break down. Because it's alive. Microorganisms. Everything that's alive is also dead. We contain these two polarities inside of everything, right? And that's part of the causal realm. When we talk about what is the causal dimension is zeros and ones. It's the binary coding that allows everything to exist. We can express this mathematically in zeros and ones through binary coding. We can express it geometrically through angles and segments, which really creates geometry, or what people are now referring to as sacred geometry, right? These are the primordial codes that give way to what we now refer to in programming languages short code, C++, Java, HTML, right? What we're doing is we're creating a short code that contains within it, it's embedded within it, a series of binary sequence, right? So A equals 0, 1, B equals 0, 1, 1, right? So on and so forth. So that every different letter, every different word that you write is now a complex series of causal coding that creates an astral formation. It creates an idea. But just as HTML doesn't make any sense to you when you see it on a page, it's not beautiful, you can't interact with it. But programmed in the right way, it gives way to the user interface, which you can interface with. That very same analogy applies to all of reality as we see it within the Spagyric cosmology of Paracelsus, that the physical world is the graphic user interface of reality, whereas the astral of thoughts and emotions, the wide realm of myriad feelings that can exist, is the astral realm, at least for humanity. And then we have this 0, 1 function, this binary coding of the universe, which is really like an on and off function of things. And then spiritual unity being the source of all things that every other dimension draws its power from, and that every other dimension is feeding into in order for the perpetuity of all things. That's the realm where everything is completely eternal, where everything is completely one, where there is no difference between good and evil or polarities. Polarities only begin to exist in the causal dimension. And that's only to create tension, and through tension comes flow, which is the astral. Astral is water, water flows. This is electromagnetic. Now, modern science actually sees this somewhat similarly. They just don't use the same terminology, but they philosophize about things pretty similarly. In modern physical theory, there are 4 primary forces, 3 of which have been quantized. That's the spiritual, which we would refer to as the strong nuclear force in physics. We have the causal, which we refer to as the weak nuclear force in physics. We have the astral, which would also correspond to what we would call the electromagnetic force inside of physics. All 3 of those have been quantized, meaning that they can be mathematically sorted out through the quanta. What has not been able to be done, and continues to remain a mystery, and there are many skeptics, which I also agree with, is that Earth cannot be quantized. Gravity corresponds to Earth, and that cannot be quantized. Because gravity is the result of electromagnesis, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force. If you change any one of those, you change the curvature of gravity. Therefore, you change both space and time simultaneously, because space and time are illusions of gravity within physics. So, with that being said, what we perceive to be physical reality is, to some degree, a quantum illusion and entirely relative. And this is where Einstein's theory of relativity really is important. For the physical dimension, we have Newtonian laws, right? Action, reaction, so on and so forth. For these other forces, they don't play by the same rules. They play by a slightly different rule. Now, alchemy has always used Kabbalah in order to, at least, I can't say always, but what I can say is from the time of the European Renaissance, alchemy has been very largely interwoven with Kabbalah. And the reason for this is that Kabbalah tends to give us a cosmological viewpoint that fits very well with a system of correspondences and gematria and other types of associations that help us to make sense of and to categorize the world by way of similarities and likeness. So how many of you are familiar with the concept that certain planets contain signatures that correspond to certain metals or certain plants, right? A lot of us are familiar with that idea here. Well, that idea actually stems from the principles of Kabbalah, or Kabbalah, technically, and we're able to take a look at things. And in Kabbalah, the first three things that come into existence are the first three Hebrew letters of Aleph, Mem, Shin. These are the first three things. Aleph corresponds to air. Mem corresponds to water. Shin corresponds to fire. You see here how we have spiritual, astral, causal dimensions. There is no earth in there. Earth happens as a result of those three things combining with one another. And that's what ends up creating air. In the same way that those first three quantized physical forces end up creating gravity itself. So, Spagyric cosmology, realistically, is extremely vast but extremely simple. As long as you understand that there are basically four elements. Well, let's start at the top. There is one. This is spiritual dimension, unity. Everything comes from and originates and returns to this source. This is sometimes referred to as the monad. The monad, in order to be able to express itself in its fullest complexity, knows itself as a polar entity of masculine and feminine polarities. This we call the causal dimension, and in alchemical terminology we refer to the feminine aspect as celestial salt, and we refer to the masculine aspect as celestial niter. Basically, this is 0 and 1 respectively. Okay, this is causal coding of reality. Those two things, because everything that is underneath the causal now also has polarity, because everything is holographic and fractal. Or as it's stated in the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, says that which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, for the perpetration or for the perpetuity would be a better translation of the one thing. The one thing being the monad, the two things being above and below, celestial salt, celestial niter, and everything created underneath that is itself polar. So celestial salt knows itself by two elements. It knows itself as earth, and it knows itself as water. Earth is the most fixed of all of the elements, the most dense of all of the elements. Water is aggressively lazy. It will do anything to be at rest. It will wear away mountains, it will gush and roar and go crazy and dissolve things in its path just so that it can exist as a lake, as a pond, as stillness. It will do anything it can to do that. So we can refer to earth being the passive of the passive element. We can refer to water as being the active of the passive element. Then on the side of niter, it knows itself through polarity. It knows itself through air and fire. Air is going to be the passive of the active element, and fire is going to be the active of the active element. Now if we take four things, we can group these four things in these orders into three different groupings. We can take fire and air, and we can group those together, and that creates sulfur. We can take, let's see if I can do that, there we go. We can take air and water, and we can group those together, and that becomes mercury. And we can take, let's see if I can do that, there we go. Mental hand workout. And then we can take water and earth, and we can combine those together, and that creates salt. Okay? Good job. So, basically, these three groupings give us what we would call the philosophical essentials of alchemy. At this point, you're like, man, I came here to learn about Pharmacopoeia. What's all this shit? Well, I have to explain that because everything in alchemy corresponds to sulfur, mercury, and salt. In terms of the physical world and the way that we interface with things, everything that we can access we can access and see, perceive, and extract and grow and, like I said, interface with the sulfur, mercury, and salt of things, which is to say the soul, spirit, and body of a material. This is absolutely and fundamentally critical in order to understand how spagyric pharmacopoeia works, because we are not working with, despite what many people might tell you today, isolated chemical constituents. It is wonderful to help us understand what isolated chemical constituents might exist in various items of spagyric pharmacopoeia, but it is not limited to that by any means. And as spagyrists, we are not working on just a physical model. We do not acknowledge that disease only originates on the physical plane. Some things can. In fact, some things, there can be an imbalance for any different condition of either the psyche of the individual, the spirit of the individual, or the body of the individual, and each of those exists simultaneously in the spiritual, the causal, the astral, and the physical dimensions. There are multitudinous algorithmic expressions of the human organism. I'm not going to go too deep into that because I'm going to be talking much more about this on Saturday, and I need some of you to show up so I'm not just talking to an empty room. However, when we are approaching spagyric pharmacopoeia, we are looking at it from addressing these multidimensional imbalances and making remedies from things in nature that are able to address those imbalances. So let's go ahead and talk about sulfur, unless any of you have any questions. I'm willing to take a few questions right now. Seems like you're all kind of getting it, wheels are turning. If you have any questions, just raise your hand. I might say just a minute or whatever else, but I will cycle back around to it. Okay, so let's talk about sulfur. In the vegetable kingdom, now every different kingdom has slightly different expressions of their sulfur, mercury, and salt. They are more or less the same, but they have a few different variations. In the vegetable kingdom, by the way, anybody who tells you that Spagyria is herbal alchemy, feel free to tell them Phoenix said that's not true. Because Paracelsus was not just sticking in any way, shape, or form with just herbs. People who delineated it into herbal alchemy didn't know the complexity or didn't care to present the complexity of spagyric medicine in its totality as presented by Paracelsus and practiced by the Paracelsian physicians. They instead decided to turn it into their own thing as an intro to laboratory alchemy. And so they made a whole bunch of items of spagyric pharmacopoeia that Paracelsus never used, including the most common one that you're going to find at my booth, spagyric tinctures. Paracelsus never made a spagyric tincture. That was not his thing, but he did make other items of pharmacopoeia. Why do I make spagyric tinctures still today? Well, because they do fit alchemical and spagyric theory and cosmology, and they work and they're very effective. But I'll help you understand here in just a moment why they're effective and how they're effective and what they are effective for versus what other items of spagyric pharmacopoeia are effective for. So, sulfur. Sulfur in the vegetable kingdom is known really in two different forms. It's known as volatile sulfur, which, as that name indicates, we still use this term in chemistry today. The volatile aromatic compounds and or essential oils of a plant are its volatile sulfur. And then we have what's called fixed sulfur. Fixed sulfur is basically all of the alkaloids, the polysaccharides, glycosides, active constituents that are not volatile aromatic compounds, that are not essential oils. Savvy? Okay. So sulfur breaks into that. Let me explain to you what those really relate to in the human multidimensional organism. Volatile sulfur is your, for lack of a better term, I'm going to use terms that are probably more familiar with all of you. In Kabbalah, they would call this the holy guardian angel. In modern metaphysics, they would call this the higher self. We can call this your existential reason for existence. What is the reason that you have existed here? What is it that your soul has the volition to accomplish? What are your inherent talents? What are your inherent interests? These are the types of things that exist as part of our volatile sulfur as human individuals. And the volatile sulfur of the plant kingdom helps us to identify every different plant has a different characteristic to our body, to our spirit, and to our psyche, and to our expression just as a multidimensional being. And different aspects of plants correspond to different aspects of our psyche. So different essential oils relate to different areas of our psyche. And what does modern chemistry even tell us? That essential oils react with the limbic system through their scent. We are literally triggering memories. We're able to heal traumas. We are able to impact neurological, for lack of a better term, impairments by being able to utilize aromatherapy, by being able to, and which extends far beyond essential oils, right? We're talking about incenses, we're talking about the scent of a freshly crushed plant as we harvest it, we're talking about the smells of our mothers as we're placed against their breast as we suckle as newborn children. We're talking about the sense of the natural world, and also now, such a hazard, the artificial world. We have trained our limbic system since the advent of synthetic chemistry to think that things smell good, or to relate ideas that are entirely synthetic, that don't exist in nature, and by so doing, we are becoming synthetic beings from a neurological perspective. This is why I think that we need to advocate strongly against the use of synthetic scents in anything and everything, laundry detergent, and again, what does modern chemistry and medicine show is that these types of scents are actually damaging to the endocrine system, well, to the entire neuroendocrine system, and can create severe hormone and neurological disruption. So we're seeing eye to eye on this. The research exists there medically. The research exists there alchemically. We just need to put these things together and really think about them and live in a way as if we actually care about our existence. So, the volatile sulfur is our higher self, our volition, our drive, what each individual in this room and what each individual on this planet is born for. And how many times do we see with cases of depression, which is a psychological disease that people don't know what they're there for. They have lost their way, they've lost their meaning. And this is where various different medicines that are very volatile, including many different psychedelic substances, are able to help us recalibrate to what our innate potential is, to what our innate interests are, to what our innate talents are, and to be able to live in a way that is meaningful and fulfilling. Okay, the other aspect of sulfur, fixed sulfur. The fixed sulfur of the human organism is the color of our hair, the way that we dress, the sound of our voice, color of our eyes, our skin. It's the way that we appear to the world. In the plants, it's the way that they appear. Are they green? Are they blue? Are they pink? Are they red? What pigments come out of them when we extract them, right? What makes St. John's wort red when we extract it versus what makes lemon balm green when we extract it. Those are the aspects that stay behind when we extract the plants with a mercury, when we extract the plants with a solvent, right? Whether that solvent be water or acetic acid, diethyl ether, ethanol, okay? The things that color the tincture and that flavor the tincture, with the exception of the volatile aromatic compounds or essential oils, that is the fixed sulfur of the plant, and those help our fixed sulfur. Now, largely, like many of you have probably noticed, I've been breaking out around my eyes. I'm a very pitta individual, which is to say in alchemical terminology, a very sulfurous individual. And I have a lot of heat, naturally. I'm like a furnace all the time, and I hold a lot of liver heat, for those of you who speak Chinese medicine or Ayurveda. And so I've been eating things here, like eggs or bacon or whatever else. Anytime I do that, my eyes break out, sure as shit, 100% of the time. Skin breaks out, doing the very same thing. You get red patches, you get eczema, you get psoriasis, you get lumps, you get all sorts of different types of things, right? So plants that are cooling in their fixed sulfur help to address the fixed sulfur of us, our skin, our expression, the size of our bones, the density of our bones, the quality of our tissues, all of those things. For those of you who are familiar with Ayurveda, there are 7 different types of tissues, right? Or what we would translate in English as tissues. Those tissues are part of our fixed sulfur. They deal with basically the function of our physicality. The structure of our physicality is salt. The function of our physicality is fixed sulfur. Okay. Now let's go ahead and talk about mercury. Mercury exists in two ways as well: volatile mercury and fixed mercury. Volatile mercury is, in the vegetable kingdom, is ethanol. And we get that by fermenting a plant in an anaerobic environment where it cannot breathe. We kill the substance. We do not allow that plant to breathe. We literally drown it. And we allow the fungus, the yeast that are present, and the whatever other microorganisms, archaea, bacteria, etc., that are present on the outside of that herb in an aqueous environment, meaning submerged under the water, to be able to break apart the starches and the sugars and to be able to eat them. And that's what ends up creating alcohol as a ferment. Now that ferment then is mildly good. That can alter consciousness to a relatively small degree. Anybody who's had a glass or two of wine knows that. But if you have a glass or two that same size of a distilled spirit, boy, you might be going to the hospital. So realistically, we purify that ferment so that it's pure spirit, because a ferment is what? Let's talk about most wines, 12 to 14% alcohol, right? Of course, you can get them up to 18. Some yeast can get them up to 20%, 22 even, I recently saw in a certain whiskey yeast. That being said, they're usually about 12 to 14% pure, which leaves, what, 88 to 86% water? In order to get that pure mercury, the pure volatile mercury, we need to be able to distill it. So the processes of fermentation and distillation really refer to the ways that we are able to make volatile mercury or ethanol inside of the laboratory. But what does that correspond to transpersonally? Our spirit. Now, our volatile spirit is literally our discipline. What are we doing on the daily in order to be able to do the things that we want to do? Spirit is an animating force. Sulfur is just your psyche, it's just your expression. It has a volition, it wants to do things, but it itself can't do shit without an animating force. Spirit is the animating force. It's the thing that imbues life into things. And we even call distilled spirits, oftentimes, aqua vitae, the waters of life. Spirit, again, if we take a look at the Latin roots of that term, spirit comes from the Latin spirare, which means imbuing, technically imbuing with life. And when we breathe, we are respirare, we are respirating, which is to say that we are continuously imbuing with life. We are doing it over and over and over again. Our spirit and our breath, volatile, is really intrinsically connected. And how you channel your breath really is a discipline of breath. So our volatile spirit deals with discipline of breathing. Breathing, as every great world tradition that has even the remotest shred of enlightenment attached to it, will teach you that breathing is everything. How you breathe controls how you think and what you can perceive. Now we have fixed mercury as well. Fixed mercury is vinegar. And so how many of you have fermented kombucha or made a mother of vinegar at some point, right? Most of us, I'm sure, or at least have seen it done. You basically take a sugar source and water and or herbs if you want, and you ferment them aerobically, meaning that they can breathe, they're open to the air. They're not just exhaling exclusively, they're breathing in, they're breathing out. And chemically, acetobacter end up coming in through that in-breath and permeating our substrate and being able to turn whatever bits of things ferment into alcohol immediately into acetic acid. The acetobacter actually consume the bits of ethanol, and sometimes other sugars as well, and they turn it into acetic acid. And this is a fixed spirit, and this deals with daily disciplines like exercise, like movement, simple things actually like waking up when you set your alarm. Don't hit snooze. In fact, if you do hit snooze, you're destroying your capacity to ferment your fixed mercury. You're actually literally telling yourself, I don't trust myself. I can't trust myself. I want to do something. I've set the intention to do something, and I'm lying to myself because I'm not going to do it. If you tell yourself you're going to do it, by God, do it. Listen to yourself, because that will build your spirit. And so many of the diseases that I see from a Spagyric angle today are caused by lack of spirituality. Our whole culture is suffering from lack of spirituality. We have, in the best case scenario, replaced whatever semblance of individualized spirituality we have, our own vinegar that could be made from the plant, the unique expression of life that is us, and we have replaced it with a uniform model that has been imposed upon us by some of the greatest and most imposing world religions. And we say, I will only understand myself and my relation to divinity through this very limited expression. And I'm not saying that any of those traditions are bad, but if you take a look at the traditions, the things that most of us, especially in this room, are going to be called to and inspired by the most are the mystics of those traditions, because they speak within the terminology that is within the box of these great traditions, but they explore so far outside of the box. Rumi, in the case of Sufi and Islam, right? We could talk about multitudinous different types of saints, St. Francis of Assisi and others within the context of Christianity. We could talk about many different world traditions. We could talk about many different gurus of the Hindu traditions, and we can talk about, so on and so forth, swamis and... Correct. So, with that being said, all of these aspects of us that correspond to our daily disciplines and how much we drive ourselves and push ourselves outside of our comfort zone to grow and to connect with Source through the things that we are inherently interested in and not interested in, will help to build our fixed our fixed mercury, to be able to build our spirit and our connection to spirit. That might be devotional prayer, that might be, your acts of meditation, but it's also very common things that you say, in order for me to express myself the way I ideally want to express myself, I need to do this, and you set a goal for yourself, do that goal. It's actually quite simple. You let all sorts of excuses get in your way from accomplishing your goals, and then you wonder at the end of your life why you didn't do more with your life when all you had to do was in the moment do the goddamn thing. Mm-hmm. It's actually very simple if we don't allow the distractions around us to prevent us from doing the things that we really want to do. And in order to express the volition of the soul, you need to have discipline in order to animate it, in order to do those things.
It's like an empty commercial.
Yes. Okay, so that's sulfur and mercury. Now let's talk about salt. Salt knows itself as two different things. Salt knows itself as the salt of sulfur, and it knows itself as the salt of salt. So there are ways where we take the fixed sulfur of a material and we burn them and we turn them into salt. And in the vegetable kingdom, that turns into the exact same chemical, actually, potassium carbonate, as burning the body of the herb itself. They both reduce down to potassium carbonate. They're the same chemical substance. But they come from two different sources. The salt of sulfur actually has an affinity for sulfur from which it came. It comes from the soul. Whereas, and it again comes from the expression of who we think we are, who we identify with, who we perceive ourselves to be, the fashions that we want to abide by, and so on and so forth. Those are our fixed sulfur, and when we calcine those, they can reduce to a very pure thing, but we have to burn them in the fires. We cannot attach ourselves to the way that we look. All of that in the great world traditions is a distraction of oftentimes what is called ego. It gets us completely distracted. It detracts us from who we really are, which is the impenetrable and completely impermeable essence of our souls. And that expression, that lives on. Our bodies always die. And along with our bodies, the skin, the bones, the organs, the tissues, like we were talking about, they all degrade. You can't take that with you. But what you can take with you is the essence of that body and what it allowed you to do, actually. And that helped the soul via the animation of the spirit to achieve its volition, to gain its experience, to grow and to evolve as that entity that is sometimes in the West called a spiritual entity, but should actually be called a psychological entity or a soul entity. So we have the salt of sulfur, and we also have the salt of salt. And in the vegetable kingdom, I said that the salt of sulfur corresponds to fixed sulfur that has been calcined. The salt of salt corresponds to the corpus of the herb, the spent body. Many of you in herbal traditions will refer to that as your mark. And when we completely break that down and purify that, now we have the salt of salt. Again, it's like, God damn it, Phoenix, we're here for Pharmacopoeia. Why are you going on and on about this? Because this is very important. All of these different constituents, volatile sulfur, fixed sulfur, volatile mercury, fixed mercury, volatile, or rather we could call this the salt of sulfur and the salt of salt, are all the components that we work with in the vegetable kingdom that allow us to create items of spagyric pharmacopoeia. So, let's go ahead and talk about some items of pharmacopoeia. 1. Spagyric tinctures. Like I mentioned earlier, Paracelsus did not make spagyric tinctures. The amount of alcohol that is necessary in order to make spagyric tinctures is relatively copious in comparison to the amount of material they had to ferment and distill in most ages past before industrialized agriculture. So, with the exception of the Romans and wine and making, basic brandy and aquavitae from grapes and things like that, we didn't have a tremendous amount of alcohol just circulating around. In many ways, it's just because of industrialized agriculture that we have that ability today. But realistically, it is still a very psychological, or a very philosophical is the word I'm looking for, medicine, which is to mean that it is composed of sulfur, mercury, and salt, and different proportions of each. So if we were to take an herb, just a traditional dried herb material, that contains the fixed sulfur of the material. To a certain degree, it's also going to contain some volatile sulfur, right? How many of you have stuck some lavender in a flask and distilled essential oil out of it, even though it was dried, right? And in fact, in some cases, dried lavender is one of those exceptions where you can sometimes get more essential oil out of it than you can with fresh material. So, with that being said, it does have some volatile oils in it. That's going to be dependent on the plant, okay? If you extract horsetail has no volatile aromatic compounds, or such a negligible amount that it really doesn't have a volatile sulfur to it, but it has a ton of fixed sulfur to it. And you can tell that because your tincture gets so dark green, it almost looks black when we tincture horsetail, right? So same thing with like comfrey, for instance. Comfrey has like virtually no essential oils or volatile aromatic compounds, but it has a tremendous amount of fixed sulfur. We can tell again by the color that the tincture gives us. And we can, of course, ferment those herbs and distill those herbs in order to get an alcohol or a vinegar out of it to use as our extraction medium if we want to, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And when we're done with the extraction, now we have our mark. We calcine that mark, which is to say, well, we first incinerate it, which is to light on fire and let it smolder down. Then we crush those ashes that have been smoldered, and then we roast those ashes, typically in the vegetable kingdom, no less than 650 degrees Celsius, which is best regulated through hardwoods like oak. If you create a hardwood fire, you can roast your ashes extraordinarily well. But sometimes they're done for, as little as a few hours all the way up to like many, many weeks at a time, depending on the herb that you're working with. Many of you who work with polypores will find that they are a little bit harder to work with than what certain light, airy components of, say, like rose flower would be, right? Because the cellulose content is so much thicker and so on and so forth. And when you get to the metals and minerals and even like animal materials like eggshells and hooves and oyster shells and things like that, you'll find that those can be a little bit difficult to work with too, but the same principle applies. So we calcine and we get our ashes from this material, and they have to be as pure white as they can possibly be. And we don't stop there. You have to now extract the potassium carbonate out of those ashes. And the way that we do that is by boiling that pure white ash inside of water And then what ends up happening is the potassium carbonate is soluble in water, but the ash itself is not. And so inside of your water, you have your potassium carbonate, you filter that solution out, your ashes stay behind, the potassium carbonate's in the water. You set it aside, you take those ashes that have just been filtered and extracted, and you calcine them again. And then you boil them in distilled water again. And you keep doing this over and over and over until you're not getting any more minerals inside of your water. And then, even at that, then you can start to use vinegar. Once you can't get any more water soluble materials coming out of it, you'd be surprised. You leach it, your ashes with vinegar, and they give you a ton more potassium carbonate and a little bit, about 5% by volume, of potassium acetate as well. So we can get all of these different minerals outside, or out of rather, the herbal mark. And that is the purified body. Now what we do, actually, by the way, I should just mention, once you have all of those bits of water and or vinegar, now we evaporate all of those, and that gives us what's called crude salt of salt. What we do now is we take that crude salt of salt, we grind it, crush it, roast it, and calcine it at 650 degrees Celsius, and keep doing that and boiling that in distilled water and filtering that over and over and over again until it's 99.98% pure potassium carbonate that we're left with. And then we crystallize it. That crystallization factor is absolutely critical if you want the greatest physiological effect. Your spagyric tincture is only going to work on the level of the physical body, as well as your salts are refined. And if you want the physical body to be refined to a very, very high level, you have to crystallize that material. You have to revivify it. You have to take this body that's been broken down and burned over and over and over and give it a beautiful expression, a revivified expression. And in the Christian versions of alchemy, which are very, very multitudinous throughout all of the Renaissance, they explain this through the scriptures of Jesus dying and being calcined by descending into hell for 3 days, and then rising again by the Holy Spirit, by this distilled water, and being revivified into an incorruptible body, so that even though, Thomas can stick his fingers into the wounds of Jesus where the spear was thrust into his side by the Roman soldier and so on and so forth, he can't feel it, and he can ascend into heaven, which is to say that he can actually connect with his higher self and with spirit, and he is able to achieve this new vibration, this new exalted expression of his reality, where he is at once physical, spiritual, and psychological to a perfect and equal quintessential degree. So if you really want to make good spagyric or alchemical products, the refining of your salts is critical. And again, this is based on a philosophic component, because chemically you're going to get potassium carbonate whether you refine them and crystallize them really well or not. So it's not a chemical thing. It is the principle, it is the philosophy that we're working with. And so we are working with philosophical medicine, philosophical principles in Spagyria. With that being said, so we have a tincture, a 95% alcohol tincture, because again, we need pure spirit. The spagyric tincture is only going to work on your spirit to the purity that it has been refined. So if you use a 40% spirit, you're only working with 40% of the capacity of the spiritual intelligence of whatever extract that you're making or how it's going to impact your spirit. If you work with 95, which is the highest you can get through distillation alone, now you have a very pure spirit. And if you want to, do a couple of clever little tricks, either some number 3A molecular sieves, or you can do it with potassium carbonate as well, the salt of salt or the salt of sulfur. You could do it under special vacuum distillations, I think it's 4 millimeters mercurial pressure under a vacuum with Rashig rings and a hempel column stuffed with those Rashig rings. You can go from raw wine to 100% alcohol in a single distillation. A little tricky, requires some expensive equipment. You don't need to do that, but it is possible. But you can get 100% spirits through a number of different ways is my point. And 100% spirits would be completely ideal for you. but it also, as Spagyric, raises the cost that you're going to have to charge because now there's a lot more man time, electricity, etc. inside of the material. But it would be ideally and philosophically more pure for the spirit. But 95 is pretty damn good, right? If we're working with an A average, I'm all right with that. So we have fixed sulfur. We maybe have a little bit of volatile sulfur inside of a tincture. We have 95% spirit, and we have our salt of salt. What is in here in the greatest concentration is fixed sulfur and salt and this pure mercury. Volatile mercury at that. So a spagyric tincture philosophically works on those components of us. It has the volatile spirit, the animating life force to bring the fixed sulfur and the volatile sulfur to life of that plant, its intelligence, which again corresponds to a part of you or multiple parts of you. And this, the fixed sulfur, this is where modern chemistry can sometimes help us because alkaloids, esters, different types of chemical constituents, glycosides, polysaccharides, etc. All of these different types of things that we're able to extract, they work on various physical parts of our being, right? They work on our physicality and they work on our fixed sulfur, which is, say, our salt and our fixed sulfur. So these types of things are in there, and that's why a spagyric tincture, because it has so much salt in it, and because it has so much fixed sulfur, disproportionately what we're extracting with that mercury is the fixed sulfur, it works on that level of our being, and that's why spagyric tinctures technically work on those levels, and that's what they're good for, according to the properties of that herb. Now, if the herb has a tremendous amount of volatile oils in it, like for instance St. John's wort, lavender, etc., then those also express themselves and they can work a bit on our psychological aspects. That's why if we are really anxious and we take a spray of lavender or chamomile, we can calm down because they have a relaxing effect in their expression as plants, and that's what they're meant to do. That's what their volatile sulfur is meant to do, and it's in a higher concentration in those plants. Are you all with me so far? Okay, so spagyric tinctures, that's that. Let's go ahead and move now to spagyric essences. There are multiple different forms of spagyric essences. Many of you may know, maybe some of you don't, I guess I shouldn't just assume that you know this. I have been working towards creating standards for Spagyria because the way I have practiced and worked with Spagyria is significantly different than the way many of my peers and colleagues may have practiced Spagyria or continue to practice Spagyria based on traditions that they have. And so in order to distinguish the standards that I'm creating and the methods that I am working with and reconstructing Paracelsian medicine, but bringing it forth with modern items of pharmacopoeia and other things, we call this Aurelian medicine or Aurelian Spagyria. Again, because I've come up with it and my name's Phoenix Aurelius, so it's now Aurelian. So with that being said, within the standards of Aurelian medicine, we have in Aurelian Spagyria, we have spagyric essences per destillatio, which means by distillation. That means that we're basically taking a tincture from a plant that has a high concentration of volatile oils, and we're distilling out the alcohol. Well, what ends up happening, anytime that you tincture something that has essential oils, the essential oils bind with the mercury. The volatile sulfur binds with the volatile mercury, and they rise together. They fly together is the term that is oftentimes used in alchemical texts. And that is essentially what we're doing is we're just trying to isolate the volatile sulfur and leave all the fixed sulfur behind in our boiling flask. Because we are trying to get to a medicine that only captures the psychological healing capacity of that plant. We don't care about the physiological healing capacity. We're not caring at all about how it heals the skin, how it heals the bones or nourishes the tissues or etc. Okay? We are only caring about the psychological aspect. So if I can tell, and if I'm working with a client who has a number of diseases, say skin rashes or eczema or what we can classify as autoimmune diseases, but it originates from psychological trauma, I will find a plant that can inform that individual how to be able to release that stuck energy that they have in their psyche, in their astral body, and I can be able to formulate an essence that speaks to that and helps that release. And because the flow of energy comes from the spiritual to the causal, to the astral, to the physical, if they have impediments in the astral, and that's the root cause of the autoimmune condition, I can try and address the autoimmune condition all day long, and it won't do nothing. The best that you're going to be able to do is create temporary band-aids for a long-lasting problem. And so we address chronic diseases that have their root in higher dimensional aspects by addressing the dimensional aspect that is affected. And in this case, if it's the psyche, if it's in their feelings, if they don't feel safe, if they feel traumatized, never able to decompress from that trauma, then we have to match the item of pharmacopoeia to be able to do that. And in theory, spagyric essences work very well with that, because spagyric essences of all different sorts contain very high quantities of volatile aromatic compounds and essential oils that, again, interact with not just the limbic system. When we take them in, they interact with our cellular material. And as we know through the field of epigenetics, the things that we take in actually become part of our cells. And these things that are inside of our cells oftentimes contain our genetic code. And they're able to change the cellular environment, they're able to change the genetic environment, and they're able to impact us epigenetically. And so items of pharmacopoeia that are spagyric essences tend to work on the psychological and sometimes on just the etheric. The etheric, Paracelsus called this the archeus, as you and I were talking about earlier, Stuart. And it is the bridge that exists between the astral and the physical. It is like literally the meeting point where those two places kiss. If we were to point out where the archeus exists in real life, we would say it's where water meets earth. So as you're standing on the beach and you see the waves lapping up at your feet, that's where earth meets sea. It's a sacred threshold. And that sacred threshold is a portal of sorts into the astral. And in fact, anybody who has studied Celtic shamanism or Druidry to any extent will know that that's one of the three sacred thresholds of this world, places where you can go and visit the Fae, the She. So with that being said, and that's also true in Peruvian and Amazonian cosmovision, it's true in lots of different types of world traditions. So with that being said, we have essences per destillatio, which are basically made by taking a tincture, distilling out the material, and then you don't just do that once, because the amount of essential oils in there is actually really quite small at that point. What you do is you take that distillate that you just distilled out and you archeus, and to be able to stimulate various acupoints would be another term for that. The way that we can do that is by fermenting the herb. So you take an herb, you ferment it, and then you distill out the alcohol from that to 95%, and then that's that. You add your salts after you calcine everything that stayed behind in your boiling flask when you distilled it, and all of the spent fermentation material. You add that back to your thing. That's called an essence per fermentatio. So, and you can blur the lines between it. If you want to, say, do an essential oil distillation and then take your hydrosol and the spent herb material and ferment that and turn that into alcohol, then you can, and that is an even greater philosophic essence. We would call that a philosophic essence per fermentatio, because it contains the philosophic essence element, but it also contains the fermentation. That's what per fermentatio means, by fermentation element. And so it has the pure spirit of that herb, and it also has all of the volatiles and all of the salts and everything else of that herb. So it works on the spirit just as much as it works on the psyche, right? So, and in fact, essences per fermentatio, really, because they don't have any essential oils, they don't work on the psyche. They work on the spirit. We're working with the spirit of that herb. And so they help to address, like I said, our breath and our respiration, because we're making an alcohol, not a vinegar. If we were making a vinegar, those things help with the day-to-day types of tasks. If we make an alcohol fermentation spirit, that helps with our breath, our breathing, our consciousness, our awareness, those types of things. So how many people do you know that have diseases because they are so unaware of themselves in their situations. They're unaware of what they eat. They're unaware of the negative environments that they have around them, that they surround themselves with the negative, family attributes that they don't separate themselves from, or their friend group, or whatever else, that holds them back and prevents them from expressing themselves. And that holding them back from expressing themselves creates certain physiological conditions. That's where we would deal with an essence perfectamentatio, to increase their spirit, to increase their awareness, to be able to increase and enhance their consciousness. You kind of with me? Sort of with me? Okay, it's getting cold, so I'm going to wrap up here soon. There are a couple of other items of Spagyric Pharmacopoeia that you're going to find. You're going to find a chlysis. In fact, for those of you who are interested, I have a chlysis of moringa down there. You can try it. And I'm telling you, this is the hardest item of pharmacopoeia that you could possibly make inside of the herbal Spagyric catalog. And I'm selling it for the same price that I'm selling Spagyric tinctures for, because I had the privilege of being able to make a ton of it. But what a chlysis is, by definition, is where you take an entire plant and its entire purpose for its existence through all parts of its life cycle, which is to say, you plant the seed sprouts a root. That root then grows a tiny little sprout, the leaf and the aerial parts. Then it grows to maturity, and then it starts to flower, and then it fruits and or develops seed. That is the entire life cycle of the plant. A chlysis captures the entire intelligence of the entire life cycle of the plant by working with each of the individual components of that plant in order and being able to combine them all together into their fullest expression via the end. And this can include water-soluble extractions, acetic-soluble extractions, alcohol-soluble extractions. There are many different ways of creating chlysis, and it's beyond the scope of this class for me to define exactly all the ways that you can create a chlysis. But if you guys get to that point and are interested, I can show you how to do this, and I can direct you to resources too to give you inspiration, give you ideas. However, you can make this of various plants. I've done this with wild rose. I've done this with moringa, like I said, which is one of the most amazing healing plants that I've ever seen. And we're working with the roots, we're working with the bark, we're working with the leaf, we're working with the flower, we're working with the seed pods, and all of those components are all in this moringa chlysis. I strongly suggest that you guys try it. It is supremely tonifying, but because it has the entire life cycle and the wisdom of the whole life of moringa in it, and all of its water soluble, all of its alcohol soluble, all different components that are found within it, it works unanimously across all aspects of our being with the intelligence that moringa can bring to us, which is, moringa is above all else a very tonifying and nutrient and nourishing plant. So it helps to nourish all of the multidimensional aspects of us. And that's typically what chlysi will do. And sometimes chlysi are lumped into the category of spagyric medicines that are considered to be quintessences. There's quintessences, stones, and chlysi that work ubiquitously across all aspects of our being. Which leads me into my next item of pharmacopoeia, which is a spagyric stone. A spagyric stone is by taking equal components of volatile sulfur, of volatile mercury, and of salt of that plant, salt of sulfur and salt of salt, and combining them together by feeding the essential oil. There's several different ways of creating it, but the most common and easy way is by feeding the essential oil to the salt drop by drop by drop in a heated environment, lowly heated, 40 degrees Celsius, until the salts can absorb all of that essential oil. And when they've absorbed all that essential oil, you add more of the essential oil. And when they absorb all of that, you add a little bit more. And then you keep doing that over and over and over till all your essential oil is gone. And then what you do is, once those salts have become dry and they're thirsty again, then you start doing that with the mercury, with your volatile mercury. And then this ends up, over time, like after you add your essential oil to the salts kind of become waxy, right? And the chemical reaction there that's happening is not that different from saponification, where you take an alkali, like potassium carbonate, right? and you take the essential oils and the acids that are found inside of the essential oil and you feed them to them, that reaction between an alkali and an oil creates a soap, basically a type of detergent. But then that alcohol ends up creating this really interesting chemical reaction and allowing for esterification, all these other complex alchemical and very chemical processes as well, to be able to transpire that eventually will turn that waxy, what was once a waxy substance, into a very hard mass. And that hard mass is a perfect medicine that heals the volatile sulfur, that heals the volatile mercury, and that heals the body ubiquitously, all to the same degree. And once you have the stone, you can dissolve it into alcohol. By definition, the reason we call it a stone is because it cannot burn. So you can put it on a piece of tin foil and put it over a flame, or put it on a spoon, put it over a flame, and it will not smoke. It is completely hard, just like a rock would do. And it won't dissolve in water, just like a rock won't dissolve in water. That's what classifies it as a stone. So once you get it to that point, that's technically a stone. But once you set it in alcohol, with a little bit of heat and preferably a little bit of ultrasonication, it will be able to dissolve completely inside of that tincture, and then you can administer it as a tincture. So you typically see stones as a tincture. Now, a little anecdote, I have a friend and an apprentice of mine that I showed how to make these stones, and he ended up making a lavender stone. And one day, his stone was done, and he called me and told me it was done. And he's like, all right, I'm going to take some of it. I was like, all right, cool. Well, call me, after your experience is done. Well, I thought he was going to tincture it. Son of a bitch, he ended up taking a little bit of a chisel and breaking it into a piece, and popping it in his mouth. I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks, and I end up going over to his house, and his window is just like, his curtain is just kind of pushed off. Nobody's answering the door. The truck is in the driveway. I'm pounding. Nobody's coming. So I look in through that little space in the window, and he's just passed out. He looks like he's dead. It looks like he's been there for a long time. So, they can't get into the door very easily. So I have to kick open the door, and there's my buddy Reg, shit in his drawers, piss all over the floor. He's been out for a long time. And he ends up saying like, oh my God, yeah, I had the craziest experience. I was like flying. I was doing all these things in the alchemical tradition, which he was practicing alchemy with this. And with alchemy, what differentiates alchemy and Spagyria is that Spagyria is the medicinal application of alchemy. What alchemy actually is a process of self-initiation, where you're working through the Kabbalistic worlds and doing what's called path working, through working with elements and working through the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, the mineral kingdom, and the metallic kingdom. And so you're coming to become a master of nature, and you're being able to meet Mother Nature and care for her as she cares for herself. You get to denude her and be able to see all of the mysteries of how she transforms things one into the other, and be able to work with all of these different constituents and aspects of reality. So it messes with your psyche massively, because the things that you use a state of quantum observation is really all that it is. But the things that you subject your materials to in the lab, you go through yourself in real life. So if you're working with distilling out the essential oil of that plant, the aspect of that plant that corresponds to your psyche is also being separated out and secluded. And that literally causes you to retreat from humanity, that causes you to experience just this isolated, very pure component of your psyche, but in a way that if you don't have a context for it and you don't have mentorship for it, or you move too quickly with it, you can and most likely will lose your mind. Alchemy is a state of quantum observation of working in the lab, so everybody's like, oh yeah, it's so cool to like transform yourself while you're transforming things. It can be, the result is really cool. The process is the most uncomfortable thing, and it is the path of a Western shaman of this tradition. It is one of seclusion, it is one of unification with nature, and being able to know yourself to such an intimate degree that you can identify how each different aspect of nature corresponds to you and your different aspects. It's very, 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 very intense. So here's Reg taking this aspect. Now this corresponds to what is called Yesod, which is a sefer on the tree of life that deals with the moon, with Luna. And it deals very much so with the astral realm. And in fact, when you make a stone in alchemy of a lunar plant like chickweed or valerian or lavender or these other things, Mugwort would be another great one. It taps you into this dreamy, feeling-based aspect of your reality. And when you don't dilute that stone and you consume a huge portion of it, you just took on dozens of weeks of evolution in the shortest time period possible. His body couldn't handle it. His psyche could. He was aware of everything that was going on in his head. He had deep dreams and elucidations for a long time, but his body couldn't handle that. So it had to go unconscious. That will happen if you practice alchemy. So with that being said, that's one little anecdote. I've seen people lose their minds by getting into the metallic works too soon, which everybody loves to do. They're like, oh, just breeze through the herbs, learn the stuff, and go to metals. You'll lose your shit. The reason is that herbs have so many different minerals, so many different chemicals inside of them. They are a composite of various forms of consciousness. However, metals are just one atom expressed in a pure crystalline formation. They are very, very pure. They are very intense. The experience is so concentrated that if you don't spread it out and don't give yourself time to actually assimilate all that, you will lose your shit completely. And I have friends that are still in psych wards and friends who are still only semi-functional more than a dozen years later just because of this. So, yeah, alchemy is not to be tampered with lightly. But Spagyria is the remedial application of alchemy, and so we can make items as alchemists, as Spagyrists, as alchemists who are called to help other people, as alchemists who are called to be able to apply and who want to be at the bedside of the sick and who want to guide them and help them through their entire multidimensional expression. Like I said, it's a kind of a form of shamanism of the West. We can utilize these Spagyric remedies in order to help the multidimensional maladies that are at the origin of most diseases and conditions. So those are the main items of Spagyric Pharmacopoeia that you're going to encounter: Spagyric tinctures, Spagyric essences per destillatio, Spagyric philosophic essences, Spagyric essences per fermentatio, Clyci, and stones. Those are the main ones that you're going to end up seeing throughout at least my store for sure, and most of the other people that are creating items of Pharmacopoeia. So that explains a little bit about how they work, why they work, what parts of our multidimensional anatomy that they work on, and gives you hopefully a bit of a context for why certain items of Pharmacopoeia might be more expensive because of the amount of time that they take, or what parts of the multidimensional anatomy that they would work on, and why you would want to choose one over the other. All right, thank you guys very much. I know it's cold, so if y'all want to skedaddle, I wouldn't blame you in any way, shape, or form. The last thing that I want to say is that my research facility, the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, we do not take grants, we do not take investors. 100% of our funding is from what we generate by making Spagyric products and providing these to goodly folks like yourself. We have a unique business model where you're not actually buying products. You are supporting us like a Patreon with funds that are equivalent to the cost that we would charge for a Spagyric tincture or various items of Spagyric Pharmacopoeia, and we give those to you. You get your choice of whatever it is that you want. That is our business model. It's very much so like a Patreon model, and in fact, if you go to our website, it never says add to cart or buy now. It says fund this research now, because you are funding everything that we do. If you don't mind helping direct people to our site, that will help me get the word out and help to continue our research, because I have so much more clinical data that we need. I have so much more chemical testing that we need. We have so many things to do. I have a lifetime of work ahead of me, and I greatly appreciate your support. So again, thank you all so much for coming, and I hope to see you again soon.